Hello, everyone. This is going to begin our unit on graphing linear functions. We're going to start with a review of graphing coordinates, which you should have covered in 6th grade. So some vocab and some graphing basics. We have our Cartesian coordinate plane. This is called basically what we consider a piece of graph paper, or axes, you may have called these in the past. We're going to start with the quadrants. Quadrants we name with Roman numerals you may see pictured here, and we start in the top right. So this is going to be referred to as quadrant 1. And then we're working counterclockwise. So quadrant 2 is going to be to the left of that. Quadrant 3 is going to be below. And quadrant 4 finally is going to be in the bottom right. Again, we traditionally use Roman numerals for this, but it doesn't matter how you personally write it if you're answering a question. Now, when we actually talk about identifying or plotting points, it relies on the location of two numbers. We have what's referred to as an x-axis and a y-axis. So when we talk about actually identifying or plotting points, it relies on the location of an x and a y value. We call this a coordinate. Now, if you have trouble messing up or you usually mess up the order with a coordinate, I like to think of alphabetical order. X comes before Y in the alphabet, just like in a coordinate, X comes before Y. So when you write a point, let's say like 6, 2, what you're really saying is the location of this point has an X value of 6 and a Y value of 2. Now, both of those have to kind of work together. So when I plot this point, I'm going to find 6 on my x-axis. X is your horizontal, your left and right axis. So that's right here. And then I'm going to find 2 on my y-axis. Your y-axis, I like to say y to the sky. Your y-axis is your vertical, your up and down. So if we put both of those together, 2 is right here. We said 6 is right here. We're going to plot the point where those two positions meet, which would be right here. And that's our coordinate of 6, 2. It's almost like a treasure map or directions. You're telling someone to, hey, go 6 to the right and then 2 up. So this is some of the basics with plotting coordinates and reading some of the basic graphing vocabulary terms. Other information that may be important, knowing where positives and negatives exist on a piece of graph paper. Anytime we go to the left on the x-axis, that's going to feature negative x values. And anytime we go down on the y-axis, that's also going to feature negative y values. This is more or less common sense because it's very similar to how a number line works. As we go from left to right, the numbers are getting larger. And I know we don't usually make number lines up and down, but the same logic applies. As we go down, the numbers are getting smaller and smaller. So we're going to practice on this slide with identifying our reading points before we talk about actually plotting them. So I'm going to read the coordinates of point A first. Point A, it looks like, is down here. Okay, so if I want to name its coordinates first, or its where it actually is located, I'm going to look at its x value. Its x value is going to be at, this was -6, so this should be -7. I'm going to make my coordinates like this. And now I'm looking at the y coordinate. The y coordinate's that vertical line again, and it's going to be at the -4 level. So putting it all together, A is going to be located at -7, -4. Now, second, which quadrant is it located in? Remember our quadrants, we said starting in the top right and then working counterclockwise, the opposite way that a clock would move. I'm just going to throw these in so we can reference them throughout. So what quadrant is point A in? Kind of running out of space here. This is going to be in quadrant 3. And my little Roman numerals to the right. Okay. And we can work our way through the rest of these pretty quickly once we get the hang of this. So point C looks like is in quadrant 1 in the top right. And that's going to be located at, start with your X value. It's going to be at 5. And your Y value is also going to be 5. So 5, 5. Always important that we use parentheses whenever we're referring to or writing coordinates. If I just write 5, 5 with no parentheses, that doesn't really mean anything. E is going to be located right here, it looks like. Now, E is interesting because that's what we call I should have went over this on the last slide as another vocabulary term. We call that point the origin. 0, 0, where your two axes meet, where the x and y axis meet, is known as the origin. That's a location of 0, 0. And there's no real quadrant that we can name there. If you fall right on the boundary of two quadrants, or E is technically on the boundary of all four, you don't have an actual quadrant that you belong to. So we're not going to write anything for E. For G, G is pretty close to the very first one we did. It's in quadrant 3. Its x value, let's look up, is between -2 and -4, so that's going to be -3. And its y value is also going to be -3. I'm looking right here, it's y on the y-axis, it's between -2 and -4, so that's -3 as well. B is going to be located in quadrant 4. Its x value is 5, and its y value is -4. Remember, sometimes the axes won't be labeled for you. I should write my quadrants down here. If you notice here, like there's numbers, right? It skips the odds, but there's still numbers to give you something. Sometimes an axis won't have any numbers at all, so it's important to know the difference between the negatives and positives. And last but not least, point K is going to be right on the x-axis. So its x value is going to be pretty clear. That's -2. We already know this doesn't belong to a quadrant because it's kind of on the fence between two of them. What is its y value? If it's right on the axis, its y value is actually going to be 0. So the point K is going to be at -2, 0. So these were given points that are already plotted, writing down their coordinates and identifying the quadrant that they were located in. Number 5, I know the numbers were kind of weird here, but number 5 and number 11 both didn't have quadrants because they fell right on an axis where we said, hey, they don't really belong to one quadrant that we can pinpoint. You don't write like 1/2 or something like that. You have to be actually in a quadrant to be able to say this is the quadrant that that point is in. All right, and on this slide, we're actually going to plot some points. I went ahead and did a few already just to get a little bit of a head start, and I'll go ahead and do the last few as well. But just recapping what I've plotted so far, point C was at -1, -3. When I'm plotting a point, I actually like to always start with my pencil kind of right on the origin, and then I like to move left or right first, and then up or down second. So when my pen was on the origin for point C, I then moved 1 to the left because it was -1. And then I moved 3 down. Again, think of this as like directions. So wherever you finish is going to be where that point belongs, and that was point C. G was very easy. That was right at the origin, so no movement at all. For point M, I'm going to go 2 to the right and 3 down. And I followed that process for the rest of the points here. Q was right on the x-axis, so I just went 10 to the left. And I'm going to the left for a few of these because they are negative. All right, and where did I leave off? I believe K we still have to do. So let's go ahead for K, 6, -3. So I'm right on the origin. I'm going to go 6 to the right. Don't put a point yet. Some people, when the first time they start plotting points, they'll like put a point every single movement. We're not putting like a point here and a point here. So we're only going to do it when we're done with both X and Y movements. So I'm going to go 6 to the right and 3 down because it's -3. And that's where I'm going to finish. I'll put a point there, and that's going to be point K. It's a good idea to label these right away. Sometimes when you do like an activity like this, you'll plot all the points, and then you're going to forget which one's which. For F, 0, so I'm not going to move at all left or right, and I'm just going to go 8 up. So it's going to be right on the y-axis, point F. I didn't move left or right at all because the x value is 0. An x value of 0 is on the y-axis, just like a y value of 0 is on the x-axis. And last but not least, point S is going to be at 9. So I'm going to go 9 to the right and 1 down. And that's point S. So this was plotting coordinates. And we're going to conclude this lesson with you guys trying this one. We're going to read the coordinates that have already been plotted for us. There's 4 points here, G, H, I, and J. So a question should be popping up to asking you to identify each of these. We're going to go over them as well. But while I give you a few minutes to get started on that or get started thinking about that, The whole point of this lesson, like I mentioned in the very beginning, it is a little refresher course of something you should have covered towards the end of 6th grade, coordinates, maybe a little bit earlier in 6th grade. And really what this is going to help us with, this whole post review unit is going to be on graphing linear functions, basically a fancy way of saying graphing lines. So if we're going to be graphing lines, you definitely have to be able to graph and plot points to start with. So we are getting into a little bit of a graphing unit here, and it's not just graphing points for 2 or 3 weeks. We're going to move into graphing lines using like a table of values. Some of you may have heard some vocab words like slope and intercepts and stuff like that. So we're going to move into topics that you probably haven't seen before. Maybe you have in like an after-school program or something in your own personal math adventures, but just a little preview of where this is going. Okay, so if we wanted to identify these 4 points, point G, let's start with. Point G is going to be, looks like it's down here. Point G, its x value is actually 0, and its y value is -5. Remember, if you're right on the y-axis, your x value is 0. Okay, for H in quadrant 1, H has an x value of 2 and a y value of 3. X before y, just like the alphabet. For I is in quadrant 2, and that looks like it's at -4, +4. X value first, y value second. And remember, axes or your graph paper is not always going to come labeled, so be aware of what these numbers are, even though the few that we've done have been labeled for you. And last but not least, point J is going to be at -3, -2. All right, so this lesson covered reading and identifying coordinates, plotting coordinates, and like I mentioned, we're going to use this to help us eventually graph lines in the coming lessons. Let me know if you guys had any questions with this, and take care.